The Panasonic GH6 is an exciting upgrade to the renowned GH5, a camera that was a staple for underwater videographers around the world. The GH6 features 4K recording up to 120 frames per second and 5.7K recording up to 60 frames per second. I've spent the last month diving along the west coast of the United States with the GH6, and I've come back with some great footage and some mixed feelings. But before we jump into this review, make sure you leave us a like, hit that subscribe button to support our future content, and we'll get to it. Hey guys, this is Nirpam with the Underwater Photography Guide and Blue Water Photo. I'm here today with the Panasonic GH6 Micro Four Thirds mirrorless camera. It's Panasonic's newest mirrorless camera available. It's an upgrade to the really popular Panasonic GH5 and GH5S. They were both two of the most popular underwater video cameras out there, and now we've got the GH6. So will this become the most popular underwater video camera again? I'm not so sure. As you saw from the video, I took it diving in the Pacific Northwest. I had some awesome dives, diving with sea nettles and lots of macro subjects, tons of nudibranchs. Now, coming back from that, I really feel like I have some mixed feelings about this camera. It's a great camera. It's got some awesome specs. The spec sheet looks pretty incredible, but there are some reservations that I have, particularly when it comes to battery life and autofocus. So make sure you stick around to the end of the video to find out my thoughts on whether or not I would upgrade to the camera. But before that, let's get into some of the specs. So this is a 25.2 megapixel Micro Four Thirds camera. That means it has a Micro Four Thirds sensor. So that's gonna be smaller than your full frame 35mm sensors. That's actually significantly smaller. It's got about a 2x crop. So what that means is you're gonna have a little bit less dynamic range than a full frame sensor, but you are going to have more depth of field, so you're not going to get as much blur in the background, but that could be a good thing, especially if you're shooting video. Now this camera is used with Micro Four Thirds lenses. Here I have an Olympus 7 to 14mm, and typically Micro Four Thirds lenses are a lot cheaper than full frame lenses, so that's another big benefit of the GH6 being a Micro Four Thirds camera. And I've shot Micro Four Thirds for years, actually about 10 years, and I've been really happy with the format, but it is getting a little outdated, so I'll get to why this might also be an issue later on in the video. For those of you that are wondering, when it comes to photography, the GH6 is still using the contrast detect autofocus system, which is a bit slower than modern phase detect autofocus systems out there. But moving on from photography specs, video is what this camera is all about. The camera can shoot 4K at 120 frames per second video, and then it can also do 5.7K up to 60 frames per second. So on both ends of the range, you can shoot at a high frame rate and really slow it down and get it stabilized, and you can get some really cool slow motion shots, or you can shoot 5.7K and then crop that later, export in 4K, and there you can get better macro crops. So if you're shooting at 5.7K and you crop in post-processing, you can get a lot closer to your images. And that's something I took advantage of in all my macro shooting. The GH6 has chroma sampling up to 422 10-bit, which is great if you are an editor and a color editor. It really lets you bring out the best range of colors possible for the camera. Now that can only be done on certain frame rates and resolutions. So if you want to shoot 5.7K up to 60 frames per second, that's going to have to be 420. But in a lot of cases, you can do 422 10-bit, which is awesome. Going along with that, the picture profiles available in the GH6 are more extensive than the GH5 and GH5S. So you can shoot in V-Log. For those of you that don't know, a logarithmic profile allows you to basically take more details from your highlights and your shadows and incorporate that into the video and get better dynamic range. So you can shoot V-Log on this camera. You can also shoot ProRes high quality. So that's an awesome profile to have if you're really a colorist, and I've been pretty stoked to see that in the GH6. Now, when it comes to battery life, the battery life on the camera is pretty atrocious. It's 350 shots if you're looking at the battery life photo rating. So you can take 350 photos before that battery dies. This is actually less than the GH5 and the GH5S. What I found that translated to, if you're shooting video fairly heavily, that will translate to about 1.5 dives. So you're gonna wanna change your battery after every dive. But the benefit of having a low battery life is your camera will never overheat, and that's compounded by the fact that you also have a fan built into the camera. That fan makes the body depth a lot larger, so you are looking at a camera that is, getting towards the size of a full frame camera, but you do have this nice fan, so the camera is basically guaranteed to never overheat underwater. But I do recommend changing the battery after every dive. So the GH6 is built in with an HDMI Type A port, for those of you that want to basically record video on an external monitor. It's a great system for that. Now, with this Ikelite housing, I believe it doesn't have an M24 port, but you can get that built in after you order your housing, or if you order through us at Blue Water Photo, we'll be able to get that added for you if you want to shoot with an external monitor. Now, one of my favorite things about the GH6 is it actually has this built-in CF Express card slot, which allows you to download or upload video footage at higher write speeds. And when you're shooting, that means you won't have any lag in your camera operation, because it's going to be able to record at 4K 120 frames per second fairly easily, very quickly. Now, when it comes to build quality and button layout ergonomics, I love the camera for topside shooting. It's got a really nice layout that's easy to use with a lot of different dials and switches. Like, you have this nice switch for your focus mode. You got some pretty nice, easily adjustable dials for your movie modes, and some custom C1 through C4 settings. And then it's just well placed out when it comes to video. You have a white balance button, an ISO button, EV compensation button, a couple of dials. There's only really 2 dials that you want to work with underwater, and also a drive dial right on the side. So overall, with the buttons and switches and dials, I love shooting at topside. Underwater, it's a little bit clunkier, but overall it's still pretty good. One of my favorite features when it comes to GH6 is the fact that when you hit the shutter, you can actually use that to start recording when you're in movie mode. So that's not something that's available on most cameras, and it makes it just really easy and intuitive to use underwater in that sense. So moving on, let's talk a little bit about this camera for underwater photography before I get into video. It's a pretty quick decision on my part. If you're an underwater photographer, this is not the best camera for you. If you're a Micro Four Thirds shooter, you should look at the Olympus OM1, or just older Olympus series cameras are honestly a better bet. The OMD EM5 Mark III and the OMD EM1 Mark III are both excellent cameras if you're a photographer. Now, if you're a full frame shooter, there are other full frame cameras on the market for this price or cheaper that are going to be much better cameras. Now, that being said, the image quality on this camera is good. I wouldn't say, it's the best in the world. You have full frame cameras that are the same price for the body as you do for this camera, but it is good for a Micro Four Thirds camera. But what really gets me when it comes to the GH6 for photography is the fact that the autofocus system is still contrast detect autofocus. It's not the newer phase detect autofocus system, and that means your autofocus is ultimately slower, as I found out when I was shooting underwater. I didn't really use the autofocus tracking system. It didn't work very well when it came to tracking most subjects, and I also just found overall, especially when you're using center point autofocus, even if you're on autofocus single, it has a really hard time finding subjects, particularly because water really creates less contrast when your camera is looking through water that's filtering out all this light. So overall, I'm not too happy with this camera for photography, but I did get some excellent photos. So if you're a video shooter and you want to take some photos for your YouTube channel thumbnails, then this is going to be an excellent option as well. I do think overall, topside is going to be better for photography. It's going to have an easier time autofocusing. But for me personally, I think there are better options out there, value for money. Now, when it comes to underwater video, this is where the GH6 gets a lot more interesting and honestly a lot more appealing. As I mentioned before, this camera can take 4K at 120 frames per second. What that means is if you're shooting underwater, let's say a nudibranch going by, and you don't have a tripod, combined with the in-body image stabilization on this camera, which is excellent, you can sit there handheld, film a nudibranch with a macro lens, and slow it down later 4 times to get it to 4K 30, and now you've got an awesome clip that's really stable even though you don't have a tripod. So that's one of the biggest appeals of shooting with the GH6, and that's why I do love it for underwater video. As a run and gun shooter without a tripod, it's going to be an excellent option compared to the GH5 or the GH5S. Along with that, if you're shooting at 5.7K at 60 frames per second, now you can crop in even further to that nudibranch if all you want is a 4K video at the end of your video production. It used to be that you had to shoot 4K video with the GH5 and then crop down to 1080 and then you're exporting in 1080. So the nice thing is you have a lot more reach because you can crop a lot more with the 5.7K at 60 frames per second. And honestly, I was shooting that a lot of the time just so I could get a little bit of reach if I needed to. Now, the in-body image stabilization on the GH6 is excellent. It's rated to 7.5 stops. So what that means is you can theoretically shoot in lighting conditions that are 7.5 stops darker handheld than you would have been able to in the past. Would I say this image stabilization is as good as Canon? Probably not. The Canon R5 and the Canon R6 have 8 stops of in-body image stabilization, and I noticed that they were significantly better when shooting video handheld underwater. But I do think it's better than Sony video cameras, and that's something to keep in mind if you're looking at a camera with the best stabilization. The GH6 actually probably outperforms the A7S III in some ways, so that's something to keep in mind. But we're talking about a micro four thirds sensor here, and that's where things get a little bit complicated when it comes to, is this a great video option at the moment? Now, a micro four thirds camera can have a lot of benefits when it comes to underwater video. One of the biggest benefits is that you have a deeper depth of field. So more of your image, more of your video is going to be in focus at a given aperture. And that can be beneficial if you're shooting macro. So as a macro video camera, this could be a really good option. But the biggest downside is just in general, having a micro four thirds sensor is going to give you less image quality. And when I say image quality, I'm talking about dynamic range, I'm talking about detail, I'm talking about the selection of lenses you can use. And because the micro four thirds sensor is smaller, your pixels are also smaller at 25 megapixels, which means that in low light conditions, you're actually going to get a little bit more noise when you're shooting at higher ISOs. So overall, your video is just not going to be as good as with a full frame sensor. And when you're looking at a $2,200 body and you're looking at a $2,500 body for the Canon R6, well, it gets a little bit more ambiguous whether you would want to go for the GH6 or the Canon R6. Now, when it comes to picture profiles and codec options, I love what's built in with the GH6. I was a little disappointed to know that you actually have to buy the Vlog profile with the GH5. Well, with the GH6, Vlog is built in, and I shot log most of the time when I was filming. It's easy to color grade, I enjoy shooting with it, and it's great having all that dynamic range, and I'm really excited to have ProRes as well on the camera. So both of those options are great if you're a colorist, and they line up pretty well with contemporary cameras in terms of how nice those picture profiles are to use. As I mentioned before as well, having that 422 10-bit video footage is also really nice for color grading, and I made use of that as well. But as I said before, you do have to be aware that if you're going to shoot 5.7K at 60 frames per second, it's only going to be 420. So generally I recommend if you're shooting Vlog, you want to use 422, and you're just going to have to kind of take advantage at vlog at the most opportune moments. And when it comes to getting the right color with the GH6, the nice thing is setting the white balance is actually fairly simple. All you have to do is click the white balance button, scroll to custom white balance, click the up button, and then you click OK, and that allows you to basically align a box with whatever your color or whatever your grayscale card is, your white card, and then you can do a custom white balance that way. So all you have to do is tell the camera, here's my white balance. You don't have to take a photo to set the white balance. You just have to line a box up and click OK in order to do the custom white balance. So I enjoyed setting custom white balances on the GH6. I think it's a little more intuitive than the Canon cameras. So if you are really into custom white balances, I would look at the GH6 or the Sony a7S III. They both are really easy to use. The Canon cameras are not quite as easy to use, and those are gonna be easier to use with a video light. Now, I found that my manual white balances overall were fairly accurate, and overall the white balance, even the auto white balance on the GH6 is good. It's a little bit on the warmer side, and honestly what I've always been a little bit confused about is the GH6 really seems to be a little oversaturated in the colors. If you like that look, which I personally do, then it's good, it's fine. Your video looks great, but it is gonna look a little oversaturated, which I thought is interesting. You can always desaturate in post, but I've thought that the white balance isn't completely accurate. It's not going to be as accurate as the full frame camera options out there. And finally, when it comes to autofocus in video mode, I thought the GH6 did okay. It was able to actually find animal subjects, including jellyfish, which I thought was pretty cool, and focus on those. Most of the time it did a good job. However, it wasn't quite as good as other cameras on the market. As I mentioned, you have a contrast detect autofocus system here, so I would probably get focus gears for all of your lenses and use the manual focus in conjunction with the autofocus on this camera, just depending on what you're shooting. So I wouldn't say that it's good enough to use autofocus all the time yet, but it is pretty decent, and I used it most of the time when I was shooting video. So let's move on to talking about who should buy the Panasonic GH6. At $2,200 for the body, I think it's an excellent option for underwater videographers, but there are some caveats. So if you're a videographer that really needs the best stabilization out there, that really needs to slow down their video, or wants to do a lot of cropping and wants to do a lot of macro video, the Panasonic GH6 could be a good option for you. The reason for that is at that $2,200 price point, there's really not any other cameras that can do that 4K at 120 frames per second. That being said, it's much better to look at the Sony a7S III if you need that, because at $3,500, even though it's $1,000 more, you get a lot more features, and it's going to be a lot better of a video camera than the GH6. But if you need to stay around that $2,000 price point range, this is a good option. Now, even though you have all this great stabilization, the downside is your image quality is not going to be better than contemporary options out there. There are a lot of options in that $2,000 price point range that have a full frame sensor. At this point, I think it just doesn't make sense to invest in a micro four thirds sensor for $2,000 when you have great full frame cameras. So I personally would look at the Canon R6, because when you're taking 4K 60 frames per second video, that one doesn't crop. So you can take full frame video without a crop on the Canon R6. There's the Sony a7 IV. That's another great underwater video option. It's more of a hybrid camera as well. And it does crop at 4K 60, but you still get better image quality with the crop because it's an APS-C crop and it's not a micro four thirds, which is going to be even further cropped. And then finally, there's the Nikon Z6 II, which is honestly a cheaper camera than the Panasonic GH6. So I would even look at the Z6 II because I think that's an excellent camera. It's got excellent options. Now the only downside there is I don't believe it has N-Log. So I think you would have to do that with an external recorder. And in this case, you can use N-Log when you're shooting with V-Log when you're shooting with the GH6. So if you're investing into a video camera for the first time, the GH6 isn't the best investment. I do think the micro four thirds lens format is not a future-proof lens format at this point. I don't think there are going to be that many models out there that are just going to be good value for money. That doesn't seem like where these companies are headed. I think that because things are getting higher end, it's better to look at full frame options because there's just a lot more out there. Now, if you're starting from the place of having a bunch of micro four thirds lenses, I think the GH6 is an excellent option. If you really need the best of the best for video, you don't like shooting with a tripod, you like just kind of run and gun shooting, and you want to really stabilize things, the GH6 is a good option. Will it give you better video quality, you know, by a long shot? Maybe not. I mean, you're looking at fairly similar video, but if you want to be able to shoot 5.7K and crop down, or you want to be able to shoot at 120 frames per second, I think it's worth the upgrade, but you really need to have those micro four thirds lenses to begin with. But if it comes to underwater photography, I just wouldn't buy this camera. I didn't like it. I don't think it's a great option for photography. I got some great photos. You can get great photos with every camera, and it's a good option if you're a videographer that wants to take some photos, but there are other micro four thirds options out there for photography that are a lot cheaper and that are just gonna be better overall. And finally, if you're a diver looking to buy this camera, the thing that you need to really consider is the battery life. If you only have 1.5 dives on a single battery, like I got consistently, then you're gonna wanna start thinking about, well, you know, are you okay with taking the camera out of the housing every time you dive? After one dive, getting a new battery, putting it in, and doing that 4 times a day when you're on a liveaboard, it's not really a great option. And unfortunately, there's not a vertical integrated grip that can extend the battery life available for the GH6. So even then, you know, it's possible that built-in battery packs will be developed for some of these housings, but most housings will not have the option to have any kind of dummy battery, and you're gonna be stuck with having the battery that you have in the camera, and it's gonna last about 1.5 dives. So would I buy the GH6 as a new system? Probably not. Would I buy it as a micro four thirds shooter? Probably. Yeah, if I was gonna be really into video, I'd buy it as a micro four thirds shooter. One of the other benefits of the GH6 is that you can get them right now. A lot of cameras are not available right now due to supply chain issues, and the GH6 is. Speaking of availability, there are a few housings that are available for the Panasonic GH6. There's a housing from Ikelite, which I shot for this review. There is a housing from Aquatica, and there is a housing from Nauticam. Now, I do expect more housings to be released in the future, but those are the housings currently on the market. So reach out to us at bluewaterphotostore.com, and we'll hook you up with a housing and get you all set up. We can discuss price points with you, functionality, all of that. Now, when it comes to underwater lenses, I recommend with the GH6, if you're a video shooter, then I was using the Olympus 7-14 2.8. The Olympus 9-18 also works very well as a wide-angle lens, and these are both rectilinear wide-angle lenses. You don't really need to open up to 2.8, so you could get a slower lens than a 2.8, but it's also nice to have just to bring in more light into your sensor. When it comes to macro lenses, I shot with the Olympus 60mm macro lens. I think it's an awesome option for the GH6. There's also a Panasonic Leica 45mm macro, which is another great option. And that about sums it up. I would say, again, I have mixed feelings about this camera. I think it's an amazing video camera. I think there's other options out there if you're not already invested into micro four thirds sensors. And as a photo camera, not too happy with it. The autofocus does need improvement, and most importantly, the battery life is not very long. But when it comes down to it, it doesn't matter what camera you shoot. Each one is gonna get you awesome results. It's really more about what you do with the camera. And I did a lot with the GH6. I was very happy with it. I think it's a content creator's dream in a lot of ways, being able to do 4K 120, 5K 60. It expands the horizons of underwater video, and that's really all that I want to see in a camera. So, if you have any questions or comments or differences of opinion, be sure to drop them in the comments below, or you can reach out to us at sales@bluewaterphotostore.com. If you like the video, make sure you like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have more great content, more reviews coming out. I'm hoping to get some more housing reviews out too pretty soon here. And with that, I hope you guys are able to get out in the water with this camera. I'm excited to see what people produce with it, because it really does expand the horizons of underwater video, even though I have my reservations. So I hope to see you guys out there.